Okay. I'm Madeleine Naomi blank. Birth name, maiden name was Goldring, um, and that was my father's. My mother's maiden name, as we know it, was Baram, Baram or UM, but we really don't. But when we look back on her records, we cannot find her at Ellis Island when she entered, because she came with an older sister, a widowed already, when her sister came with a young son, uh, and she came with her, and I think she came in as her daughter with her widowed sister's name. I think that's how she got kind of out of Russia. So she came, and she must have been 14 years old. She was born in 1904, although she always said 1908, as did a lot of women in those days, not proud of their age. And my father was born in 1900, and he was about 17 or 18. And I do have his naturalization papers. My sister has one of his passports because he returned to Poland. He was from Lublin, Poland. My mother was from the Ukraine, possibly Kiev. I'm not really sure the exact place, but in the Ukraine someplace. And so we don't really know her true maiden name because of the way she entered. But my father was Moshe, he was Moses, and on his naturalization papers and his passport, I think it still says Moses Solomon Goldring. You want to know how I came to Savannah? We were very good friends with the Kernesses. I had been in my bio lab at Brooklyn College. Jules and I were at this lab partners. There were four of us. And then I met Phoebe when we each had a 9-month-old at a Lalaji League meeting. And we sort of determined that I knew him, and she started talking about different things at this meeting, and I didn't know Phoebe, but, and we weren't in classes together, but I don't know, we just figured out that there was some connection between Jules and I. So when they came down here in 1996, mostly they had been visiting us on their way down and visiting Rabbi Belzer, and we started visiting them. And we started coming for the high holidays. We were unaffiliated at that time because our children were a little bit older, and I didn't like the synagogue that was right up the street from us, and had left Beth Emeth in Wilmington, Delaware. And so we started visiting them. And at some point, my husband says, it took you 3 years to convince me. So we came right after, in December of 2001, after 9/11, after they had bulldozed the old building down. But we celebrated a couple of Rosh Hashanahs here. And we just loved the people. My husband would have moved here, as I say, 3 years ago. We were here in the summer of 77, not at the temple, but we toured Savannah. And I said to my husband, you might like this place, but I ain't never coming back here again. Because we went to Pulaski with the 3 kids, and I got chewed alive. And I said, you might like Savannah, but I ain't never coming back here again. But when we started visiting the Kernesses, and I even worked the food fest when we'd come down, especially because my Cy was semi-retired, and I had a job, but it was a part-time job, and I could get away. And so we just liked it more and more. I was at the deli booth at the food fest forever. We fell in love with it. And then our daughter had a baby in July of 2001, and our son had a little boy in October of 2001. We were out there visiting because she had a difficult C-section, And after her mother left, we went and stayed 2 weeks with her because my son was a pilot. He was a new pilot with Alaska Airlines, which he is to this day. And so he had, you don't want to say to a new job, I can't come. So we stayed out there. I think my husband celebrated a birthday out there, and we left probably on the 14th of November because his birthday is the 12th of November. So anyway, to make a long story short, we came back. Oh, Phoebe called me and said there's an apartment available in the complex. And we said, okay, we'll get in touch with them. We came back on a Wednesday. We put our house on the market on Saturday. And the first or second person who came in from one real estate person bought it. And we packed up, and we were in that house for 25 years to the day. We had moved from Albany, New York, and to Newark, Delaware. And we packed up, and within a couple of weeks, from the beginning of December when we sold our house, we left there on the 16th, arrived here on the 18th of December of 2001. And I have to say, as far as Judaism, as far as being connected, it has been the most wonderful experience of my life.
Let me ask you a few questions that really deal with the fact that you have told this incredible story that throughout has to do with the immigrant experience, but traveling and Jewish geography. So when Jews talk to each other and they talk about Jewish geography, what are they really talking about? And tell me a little bit about growing up and hearing about the generation that came before, what the immigrant experience was like, and how that impacted the way they felt about being in America.
It's interesting. My mother, till the day she died, was kosher, even out of the house, okay? My father was very secular. He contributed to places like Solomon Schechter and all of the Jews. We grew up basically in Brooklyn, New York, in several different locations, except for 2 years when we moved to Los Angeles. But growing up in Brooklyn for most of my life, there was no doubt that I was Jewish. And I knew that my parents would never have accepted at that point in time. You're talking 50, 60 years ago, somewhere in that vicinity, 55 to 60, that they would have never accepted the fact that we would marry out of our religion, even though it was a secular household. They didn't really make a Seder, but they did. My mother on Friday cleaned and cooked it for the weekend, and she really didn't cook again until Sunday. And then a lot of times on a Sunday, we'd go out to the kosher deli. I didn't really have non-kosher food, so to speak, until I was a teenager and went with my friends for pizza, for things like chicken or veal parmesan at the Italian place, and different things that I now love. My father felt, as many Jews at that, neither of them were felt that but I knew they had certain expectations for us. We always knew, even though they probably maybe they went to grade school. My mother, maybe even less. My mother was fluent. She must have had some education because she was fluent in Russian. She was fluent in Hebrew, Yiddish, and to this day I understand Yiddish because it was spoken in the house. But I've pointed out to a very good friend of mine here, the one thing my parents never did was speak to us out of the house, or even among themselves if they were out of the house. And my father being from Poland, they spoke kind of a broken Russian and Polish kind of jargon, because Lublin is kind of closer to where the Russian border. It would slip back and forth between Russia and Poland. So there's, but they never spoke out of the house. And we knew, my sister and I, we both knew that what their expectations were for marry somebody Jewish and go to college. I mean, you knew that was, it was. And growing amongst, I mean, I was attracted when I was young to Jewish boys as well as Italian boys who were in the neighborhood. I just finished a book called Brooklyn Story, and it takes place in some neighborhoods that I lived in, and it's very, very meaningful. You know, I just gave it to my oldest friend chronologically. She'll be the same age as I am in a few weeks, but she grew up in the same neighborhoods. We met in 4th grade when I came back from California. But even in California, I knew my mother would get kosher meat, and in LA that was easy. In Brooklyn it was easy, you know, to do that, to keep kosher. And also to eat out of the house in places like New York and LA where they had kosher at that time. I never felt like an immigrant. I always was self-assured, or I never felt first generation. And it wasn't until we moved to Albany, and a friend of my daughter's, who was a day apart, they were a day apart, and had her bat mitzvah the week after my oldest child, Lori, had hers, and her mother said, she grew up in Saratoga Springs, and she said, you don't know what it is to live in a minority community. It's different than growing up in New York City, where there are so many Jews, and you're just Jewish. You don't have to belong. But there was always a calling in me. And Esther Goldreich, who signed my ketubah, is the sister of Gloria Goldreich. Esther died not too long ago, and I don't know what of, but I see her sisters writing in Hadassah magazine, and I read her books, and Esther was a very good friend. Esther was from a pretty, I would say, conservative home. And when the holidays came, my parents didn't go. They said, well, if you want to go, you can go. So I used to go with Esther, with her family. And even though there was a mechitza, I still loved the music, the prayer, the continuity of being among Jews.
I have to tell you, there are so many subjects, and these are 20-minute interviews.
I know.
I love this. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things, and then I'm going to let you go and talk about. All right. So you talk about your parents not speaking Hebrew or Yiddish outside the home, even to each other. Was it more because they didn't want other people to know that they were Jewish or greenhorn, or they wanted to impress upon you that America is for Americans, and you have to be American, and to be successful, this is what you have to do? Or is there a backstory in some way of anti-Semitism or anti-immigrant? And then I'm going to ask you about something else that is amazing, is that a girl growing up when you did, that your parents insisted that besides marrying someone Jewish, that you went to college. That was not the expectation for a girl necessarily in an immigrant household to be educated. So tell me a little bit, and you're an educator, and this love of learning, is that a Jewish thing, or was that just your parents, or do you think that was just something in the surroundings where you grew up that made it easy for you to get an education?
I went to high school, probably one of the best high schools in Brooklyn, which was Lincoln High School. A lot of famous people came out of there. Neil Sedaka was in my graduating class. And I sang in the Glee Club, and we sang a lot of spirituals, but the choir director was Jewish. But we sang a lot of, about Noah, Go Down Moses, and all of those Negro spirituals. I don't know what it is. It's just love of music, love of Judaism. And my only regret is when my kids were in Sunday school and Hebrew school. Even though I taught Sunday school, I didn't really, I read their books, but it's not the same as learning at that point. And that has been an open avenue to me when I got here. This, learning from you, from Julie, from Jules, all the people who have made it so available. even though I did read a lot, even when we lived in Delaware with Rabbi Grumbucket gave me some books to read and all that, I knew I was Jewish. I mean, it wasn't a question of being Jewish, but I just had this thirst. I feel here I've completed my Jewishness. There, other places it's just been limbo. But when we lived up in Albany, even though there's a large Jewish community, Lori Taylor's parents are from there originally, and I've never had trouble being Jewish. Okay? I've never had trouble being Jewish. And there's a certain amount, like we had the Reconstruction, which is what it is, up the street from us, and I could have gone there. Stephanie started out her Hebrew with them. They were down on the campus at that time at the University of Delaware, and she just didn't like it. They didn't like people came and went during a service. They didn't get dressed up. They looked schlumpy, as they said. Ma, we don't do that. We'd already belonged to Reformed Temple from the time, and that's when we affiliated. When Lori probably was in first grade is when we affiliated with Beth Emeth in Albany. And Phoebe and Jules had switched from the conservative to the reform, which was a big switch for him, not for her. But so that's where it started, and active and doing mitzvot, whatever it was. And then when you got here, it's part of the game. You have to belong to something in this town. I mean, I did it at that time for my kids, but here it's for me.
You know, I always teach that Judaism isn't a religion of place. You don't have to belong to a synagogue or a Jewish institution in order to be a Jew. So tell me, thinking back as far as you can, what is it in your education, in your upbringing, in your background that you remember the fondest about a memory that taught you that you were Jewish? And what do you hope that you have instilled in your children? What is that essence of what Judaism really means that you hope that you have given to your children and grandchildren?
When my children were old enough, you know, as they got on to college and all, you have to give them wings. You can't make them stay where you are, as much as we would like to have them close by. And I think that's the thing if my children ask me for advice, I will give it to them. I will tell them what I think. But the decision as adults has always had to be theirs. What I see, if I don't like what my children are doing with their children, then I just sit back, because I'm not going to outlive them and their children. Hopefully, So it's their mistake to make. I've made mistakes. We all make mistakes. We would have never moved to Delaware if I had realized how hard it was for teenage girls to work their way into a community. Not even the fact of being Jewish, just to work themselves into a community, because there were other people in our community that were Jewish. And then eventually the temple built up the road, but they had a very hard time connecting. And it wasn't until they went to college that they really made some really good girlfriends and guy friends.
So we've talked about connections to your immigrant past, connections that you made through school and classes that brought you to Savannah, far away from what your northern experience was. How do you hope, what is the legacy that you and Cy are leaving in Savannah? What do you bring to this connectiveness to the Savannah Jewish community?
I want to say the quilt. That's one of my biggest I feel one of the, and I didn't do it because I like the rewards or have my name on the quilt. I knew how to do it, and with your help and pushing, I did it. It's a big accomplishment. Just docening and meeting people from all over, it's just so enriching, because I'm always teaching. I guess it's the teacher in me. I guess it's the teacher always expanding and thinking about things different. I'm not closed, that this is the way to do it. And I do that with my kids. I said, there's no one right. I'm a person like I'll look to the other side, I'll look to this side, you know, and Judaism is just an integral part of me. Whether would practice Orthodox or I'm happy in this space here. And I have been since we started visiting. It's a good space. I respect the more classical, and because that's what they're used to. As I age, I realize it's harder for people to make change. It was hard for me to leave a new grandchild right behind, and Stephanie was in Delaware at that time. But you know, people have to go on with their life, and especially your kids. You have to give them wings. Not so much. Stephanie is my only one that's really committed to Judaism. Andrew is either an atheist or agnostic, but he was brought up with good values. I think the values you bring your children up with are the most important. And she, because she belonged to NIFTY, or MAFTY as it was called at one point, Mid-Atlantic Federation of Youth, she went to camp, not to camp, but to during winter breaks and spring breaks, went to camp. She's also a Girl Scout. Andrew was an Air Scout. I mean, he had his plan. Just brought them, and for them to reach for the sky. I can remember him when he had applied to West Point saying, well, what if I don't make it? I said, if you don't make it, you back down, but it doesn't hurt to reach for the sky, for heaven, and maybe it'll come true. And his things just worked for him. So, I mean, and, you know, each one is doing what they want to do.
What is the most fun fact that you've learned about the Savannah Jewish community that you like to tell when you docent? And what is the most surprising or unusual question you've ever gotten from somebody who was a visitor?
I find that hard to answer.
All right, then let's move on.
Yeah, I find, you know, because there are so many of them. And some will argue with you. My own friend who I took, my oldest friend Carol, who was here last week, her husband wasn't interested in going up to the museum. Okay. But she was very interested. And so, I mean, he asked me a question. I said, no, that's not correct. This was a church. He kept insisting. And that's happened to me before. One time, Rabbi Belzer was going by and he came. He said, is there anyone style for a church? You know, when people insist. And it's usually New York Jews. And one of the nicest things that was ever said to me about Phoebe and myself being here, you have come here and been very respectful of our history. You have made your way in this community, but you have sat back, you have listened, you've given when you given information when you've been asked, but you haven't tried to bamboozle people with your opinions. So I would say that is the most I feel when somebody like Jane says something like that to you. And I just always felt different times when we've been ushering at events and Jane Filer would come by and she said, oh, thank you so much for ushering. You know, or some just people are different. They're different from any other place I have lived.
Just two more questions because it's already going over, but this is fascinating. Tell me about the thing with Jews and food. Is the food that we eat, is that what makes it Jewish? Is the fact that we eat certain kinds of food? Is the fact that what is it? What is our connectiveness is with food, that people think that Jewish food is Jewish religion?
I understand that the food we eat has come from the diaspora, and everybody brings something different to it. And I think about food as a community experience. You sit down to the Shabbat table, a holiday table, here on Saturdays. I mean, the welcomeness of our, lunch. Some people say, well, it's too expensive, but is it expensive when it creates an atmosphere of community? That is the most important thing. And I think everybody, in retrospect, When they complain about it and you say that to them, then they take a second look and say, yes. People feel welcome. I've heard other people say they've been to this place and this place. They really didn't feel welcome the way they do here. So it's a special place. There's no denying it.
That's kind of interesting because, in fact, maybe the Jewish value here isn't that we eat food, but that in some way, because we're together, we sanctify what we're eating.
What we're eating.
That's a
And
very
Jewish
good
food's
point.
good.
What's your favorite? Or what's your favorite thing to make?
Regular brisket. But I like it. I basically like it as sweet and sour. So I don't know if that comes from my Russian background. And I don't know. I like it all. Chopped liver. My kids
Okay.
all hate chopped liver. How could you eat that?
If you were to crystallize everything you learned about being Jewish and you wanted to give it as a gift to your children in a sentence or two, what is the legacy that you hope you've left that they learn about who they are as Jews?
To base the rules of the Torah are there for a reason. And as I read more, as there's nothing, as Julie Hirsch would say, there's nothing new under the sun. The rules, the Ten Commandments, they apply to everybody. You don't have to be Jewish. To me, that's the gist of the whole thing. We as Jews have set those as a guideline through all times. I just wonder how these young people who are coming off the street here and choosing Judaism to become Jews, what is the attraction for them? It must be something, there's something still very pure about those commandments, even though we break them at times, even though Moses broke the word of God. There is something, the Torah is the best lesson. I mean, I look at what's going on in Israel, and I go back to the Torah in Genesis, and I can't say the specific, but it told us Ishmael was going to lead a warring people as a prediction. And I have a Gentile daughter-in-law, I have a Gentile son-in-law, but still, I'll say to them, well, see, it says here. You read this part too. We have to, I don't know how to get past that. And that is the part that breaks my heart, because I don't even think it'll be settled in their lifetime. And that's a real, there was a letter, I don't know, Ron sent to people. I don't know if I have it with me. It was a letter Ron sent that this woman had written and said about Kerry, Secretary of State, and all this. Doesn't he understand? Doesn't he understand? He doesn't really understand where we're at and why. It breaks my heart.
Is there anything we did not discuss that you'd like to mention? This is your chance.
No, I said, I'm grateful to all the people I have learned with, have been with, yourself included, Joel. I mean, I've learned so much from each one. I mean, it's surprising that even your husband, who grew up in a reform setting, is so knowledgeable that when he does, as Arlene Schwartz says, Rabbi Joel's on the bima tonight, or today, and I truly make an effort to come and hear him. So, no, I'm so comfortable. I've always been comfortable being Jewish, but I'm so comfortable with the knowledge and the feeling and the mitzvot that I am able to do.
Thank you for a great interview.